On a Lakota winter count, painted onto buffalo hide, there's a simple symbol for the worst kind of year. A man's body, with lines drawn straight across his ribs. That's it. No words needed. Everyone who saw it understood exactly what it meant. People starved that winter. For thousands of years before any of this land had a name on a map, entire nations lived through 5 and 6 months of sub-zero cold, using nothing but hides, wood, fire, and fat. Most winters, they made it. Some winters, they didn't. So how did people with no insulation, no glass, and no central heating sleep through nights of 40 below and wake up the next morning to do it again? The answer is one of the most sophisticated survival systems ever built, and almost none of it looks like what you'd expect. Let's start with the picture most documentaries already gave you. A cone-shaped tent, animal skin walls, snow piling against the sides, a small fire flickering weakly in the middle, the whole thing feeling drafty, barely holding back the cold. That picture is almost completely wrong. Native nations across North America didn't have one survival system. They had dozens, each engineered for the specific climate it had to beat. The Anishinaabe of the Great Lakes built dome-shaped wigwams from bent saplings and bark, with stones heated in the fire and sometimes doused with water to push out warmth like a sweat lodge. The Haudenosaunee of the Northeast built long, multi-family lodges out of timber and bark that could shelter 20 people and more under one roof. And on the open plains, where the wind has nothing to stop it for hundreds of miles, nations like the Lakota, the Cheyenne, and the Blackfeet, or Nietsitapi, built something that modern engineers still study today, the Tipi. That's where this story is headed, because nowhere on the continent did people face a colder, more exposed winter than the northern plains. And nowhere did the engineering have to work harder to keep people alive. Building a tipi was women's work, and it was treated as a serious engineering job, not a chore. 2 women could raise one in under an hour. They'd plant a tripod or 4-pole frame, then add more poles around it, usually a dozen to 20 in total, all leaning toward a single point at the top. The cover, sewn together from somewhere between 13 and 25 buffalo hides, depending on the size of the lodge, wrapped around that frame in a shape that wasn't actually a perfect cone. It was egg-shaped at the base, tilted slightly backward, and pitched at an angle that let prairie winds slide around it, instead of slamming into it. The doorway always faced east, toward the rising sun, and away from the prevailing western winds. At the top, 2 adjustable flaps, sometimes called wings, could be opened or closed depending on which way the wind was blowing that day, controlling how smoke from the cooking fire escaped without letting rain or snow fall back in. But the real trick, the part that actually made winter survivable, was the lining. Once the cold set in, families added a second layer of hide inside the tipi, a few feet in from the outer wall. That gap between the 2 layers trapped a cushion of still air, the same principle your house uses with double-pane windows. Then they'd stuff grass or dried hay into the space between liner and cover for extra insulation. Some northern bands, like the Cheyenne in a more permanent winter camp, would even dig the floor down 4 or 5 inches and leave a raised ring of dirt around the edge as a built-in bench, with beds set on top of it, lifted just far enough off the frozen ground to make a real difference. And when it came time to move the whole village for winter, they didn't camp out in the open. They moved into river bottoms and wooded valleys, tucked against hills and tree lines where the wind couldn't reach as easily and firewood was close at hand. People who study this today still find it remarkable. One group of modern campers spent a winter sleeping in a tipi above 8,600 feet of elevation, adding a hay-stuffed liner and a 12-foot windbreak, almost exactly the way plains families once did. And they made it through temperatures that would have put most modern tents out of commission in a single night. None of that worked without fire, and keeping one going through an entire winter night was its own skill. A small, well-tended fire in the center of the tipi, right under that adjustable smoke hole, could heat the whole interior space surprisingly well, as long as someone kept feeding it through the night in careful amounts. Too big a fire wasted wood that had to be hauled or rationed. Too small a fire, and the cold won. There was also a real danger if a teepee got sealed too tightly against the wind. Smoke and carbon monoxide had to have somewhere to go, so the flaps were never fully shut, no matter how brutal the wind got outside. That balance between staying warm and staying ventilated took generations to get right, the kind of knowledge you only get from watching your mother and grandmother do it exactly right, winter after winter. As for sleep, it started with the same animal that built half the shelter. Buffalo robes, hides, taken specifically between November and March, when the winter coat was at its thickest, were stacked along the inside walls of the tipi as bedding. Worn hair side in, they trapped body heat the same way a heavy wool blanket does, just with a few thousand years more testing behind the design. Each sleeping spot had willow rod backrests set up at the head and foot, the closest thing to a headboard the plains had. During the day, all of that bedding got rolled up and pushed to the edges so the teepee could double as a kitchen, a workshop, and a meeting space. In many lodges, sleeping spots were arranged by family role, men typically on one side, women on the other, with the place of honor toward the back, facing the door. Picture 6 to 8 people sharing one 12 to 18-foot tipi through a string of sub-zero nights, pooling body heat, fabric, and fire into one tightly engineered system for staying alive. Infants got their own version of this engineering. Babies were wrapped in soft tanned hide and rabbit fur and secured onto a cradle board that could be propped up near the warmest side of the fire during the day and kept close to a parent at night. It looks simple in old photographs, but it was a tested system for keeping the most vulnerable person in the lodge alive through a season that had no patience for mistakes. Sleep was only half the battle. The moment anyone stepped outside, their clothing had to do the rest of the work. The base layer was almost always deerskin, soft enough to move in, warm enough to matter, sewn into shirts, leggings and dresses with sinew thread pulled tight to keep drafts from sneaking through the seams. Over that went the heavier layer, buffalo robes worn with the hair turned in against the skin, sometimes antelope or elk robes in regions where buffalo wasn't the primary animal, wrapped and tied to work as both coat and blanket, depending on the moment. Exposed skin got its own treatment. Bear grease, or goose grease, rubbed directly onto the face and hands, sealed in warmth and blocked windburn on the kind of days when frostbite could set in within minutes. It sounds simple. It worked. Moccasins were rebuilt for the season too. Winter moccasins were cut larger than summer ones and packed with grass, fur, or extra hide specifically so there was room for insulation, not just a snug fit. For travel across deep snow, some nations built snowshoes out of bent wood frames, laced with rawhide, the same basic engineering modern snowshoes still use. None of this was decoration first and function second. The beadwork and quillwork people associate with native clothing today mostly came later, after European trade goods arrived. Before that, every stitch on a winter garment existed for one reason, and it had nothing to do with looking good. It was there to keep someone alive until spring. Clothing and shelter solve the cold. They don't solve the other problem, which is that deep winter is also when food gets hardest to find. By midwinter, hunting parties faced real obstacles. Game scattered, snow made tracking difficult, and a missed hunt didn't just mean a disappointing dinner, it meant a tighter month ahead. So the real survival work happened months earlier, in the fall when food was plentiful and the entire community worked to make sure that abundance didn't disappear the moment winter hit. This is where pemmican comes in, and if you've never heard of it, it might be one of the most underrated inventions in North American history. Women would dry meat, mostly bison, until it was brittle enough to pound into a coarse powder. Then they'd render fat from the same animal into tallow, mix it with the meat powder roughly 1:1, and often add dried berries into the blend. Those berries weren't just for taste. They carried vitamin C, which helped prevent scurvy during months when fresh plants simply didn't exist. The result was something close to a perfect survival food. Pemmican packed close to 3,000 calories per pound, didn't need refrigeration, and could last for years if stored properly. Modern energy bar companies wish they had it this figured out. European fur traders adopted it wholesale once they saw what it could do, and generations later, polar explorers were still carrying it across the Arctic because nobody had meaningfully improved on the formula. Decades after that, the US military ran its own cold weather field tests on pemmican as an emergency ration and confirmed exactly what native communities had already known for centuries. It worked, but pemmican alone wasn't the whole strategy. Farming nations across the plains and woodlands dug bell-shaped pits into the ground, sometimes several feet deep, lined with grass, bark, or hide to keep moisture and rodents out. Into those pits went corn, beans, squash, nuts, dried berries, anything the harvest produced that could survive being buried until the thaw. These weren't private stashes either. Cache pits were often managed communally, which meant a bad hunt for one family didn't have to mean an empty winter for that family specifically. The whole point was that nobody's survival depended on their own luck alone. Picture this as a story about individual toughness, and you'll miss the real one. The real story is logistics, chemistry, and cooperation. Built by people who understood exactly how many calories a body needs to survive a northern plains winter, centuries before anyone had a word for a calorie. If you're into the real mechanics behind stuff like this, hit subscribe. We break this kind of history down every week, because even with all of that, winter still found a way to win sometimes. Late winter, specifically February, earned its own grim nickname across dozens of nations. Some called it the Hunger Moon, others called it the Bony Moon. By that point in the season, cached food was running low, game was thin and exhausted from the cold too, and the margin between enough and not enough had narrowed to almost nothing. It's the same reason wolves howl more in deep winter. Everyone, animal and human, was hungrier than usual and running out of options. This is also exactly why Lakota winter counts, the pictorial calendars elders used to mark each year's defining event, included a specific symbol just for famine, a human figure, ribs drawn as bare lines across the chest. It shows up across multiple winter counts from different bands, which tells you this was a recurring risk, one that an otherwise highly engineered system never fully eliminated. There were other dangers too. A blizzard could roll in fast enough to trap a hunting party away from camp with no warning. Snow blindness from sun glaring off white ground could disorient even an experienced tracker. And a Tipi seal too tight against a brutal wind risked the exact carbon monoxide danger we mentioned earlier, which meant the person tending that fire overnight was making a genuine safety call, not just a comfort one. Winter wasn't easy. Nobody is pretending otherwise. But it usually wasn't fatal, year after year, generation after generation, in a climate that still kills unprepared people today. None of this would have worked without everyone pulling their specific weight. Women engineered and built the homes, tanned the hides, and ran the food preservation system that kept entire camps alive through the leanest months. Men hunted, scouted weather, and kept the camp's tools and weapons in working order. Elders carried decades of memory about which valleys held wind, which berries fought scurvy, and which signs in the sky meant "move camp now." Children learned by watching, the same way generations before them had learned. That knowledge still holds up against modern testing, by the way. People who've tried recreating plain-style winter shelters using nothing but the original techniques, hay insulation, a proper liner, a windbreak angled the right direction, have slept through nights at high elevation that would challenge a modern four-season tent. Every material choice was precisely matched to the problem it had to solve, and every region of the continent had its own version of this same intelligence. Anishinaabe families in the Great Lakes were doing the same calculation with bent sapling wigwams and heated stones. Haudenosaunee communities in the northeast were doing it with massive shared longhouses that pooled body heat across 20 people at once. Different materials, different climates, the same underlying genius. Study your environment closely enough, and it stops being your enemy. None of this is locked away in museums either. Tribal historians, language keepers, and cultural educators across these nations still teach this knowledge directly today, the same way it was taught for generations before any of it was written down. If any of that knowledge is still alive in your own family, that's worth more than most people realize. There's one more piece of this story worth sitting with, because it changes how you should think about everything you just heard. This system, the tipis, the pemmican, the cash pits, the layered clothing, worked for thousands of years across thousands of winters. It wasn't a fragile tradition, barely holding on against the cold. It was a refined, tested, intergenerational technology. So when it finally did fail on a massive scale, it wasn't because the knowledge broke down. In the winter of 1883 and 1884, the Blackfeet, or Tipi, lived through what's still remembered as the Starvation Winter. By that point, the bison herds the entire system depended on had been deliberately hunted to near extinction as part of a US policy aimed at forcing native nations onto reservations. Government food deliveries promised in exchange were late, spoiled, or never arrived at all. Government counts put the death toll that winter around 300. Blackfeet records, kept closer to the ground, counted nearly twice that. The skills were never the problem here. Someone deliberately destroyed the resource those skills had always depended on. It's a different kind of story than the one we just told, and an important one, but it isn't the same one. The system you've just heard about kept people alive through real Montana and Dakota winters for longer than most modern nations have existed. That's not a small thing. So now you know the actual engineering behind how people survived winters that would kill most of us in a single night. Tipis built like wind tunnels in reverse. Pemmican, packed with more calories per pound than anything in your kitchen, and a system that only worked because nobody was ever expected to survive it alone. There's another one on screen, if you're not done yet.